Whether you're fly fishing in a stream, getting those ankles wet, or deep in the ocean casting nets, fish nerds, fish nerds, fish nerds, it's a podcast.
Just for the halibut!
Hello and welcome to the Fish Nerds, the show about fish, fishing, and eating fish. I'm Clay Groves, Chief Executive Fish Nerd, Licensed Fishing Guide, your best friend, healing from some very big illnesses here in the New Hampshire area. This show, we talk about fish, fishing, and eating fish. Our show is always interesting, usually funny, and mostly true. I'm happy to be here. I'm barely here this week. As you heard on last week's show, if you didn't listen already, go back and take a listen. Very good show about ice fishing, shack sinking, and all kinds of stuff. I got really sick, and that sickness kind of blew itself into the flu. And I don't even know how I'm still alive. I felt like I was dying this week. But more importantly, I was dying to get you a show. It's Thursday night. I'm going to my plans to get the show recorded and get it out to you by tomorrow morning, Friday. So it's nice and fresh because old shows stink. And I'll get it to you. But here's what's going to happen on today's show. I'm okay. I'm recovering. I'm about 2 weeks out from being 100%. The doctor said I only have one working lung as it is. And so my respiratory problems are heavier than what a lot of people deal with. So I'm going to have trouble breathing for about 2 more weeks. But I'm still going to keep making podcasts for you guys because I love you. So here's what you can expect on today's show. Besides hearing about me complaining about my health, Doc Martin, our chief science correspondent, is here with Dr. Gido, and they're going to discuss a paper called The Pockets of Resistance, Response of an Arid Land Fish Communities to Climate, Hydrology, and Wildfire. So super nerdy show this week. We're glad Doc's here to help us translate science into regular talk. The Crappie Hippie is here. Is going to bring us some news about fish pirates in Somalia and lots of more fun on today's show. We got a lot coming up for you here, so stay with us on the Fish Nerds podcast. This episode today is brought to you by the Fish Nerds Guide Service. If you're in New Hampshire and you want to fish with Fish Nerds, give us a call, 603-986-4335, and we can set up a nice fishing trip for you, and we'll have some fun. And if you mention that you heard it on the show here, we'll give you $25 off your next fishing trip. And we're actually booking it pretty good for February and March already. So with any luck, we're going to sell out. So if you haven't booked already, you really want to kind of get a move on it here. All right. And so we've been having a lot of fun here on our Facebook group. One of my favorite things about the Fish Nerds is the community we've built. So if you're not already in the Fish Nerds private Facebook group, get in there because that's where you're going to find a lot of the fun we have. This week, for example, Doc Martin's asking a lot of questions about like what kind of stuff should she work on for her science pieces for the Fish Nerds. We got people sharing old commercials like the Wonder Boner. John King is like the king of surveys, and he's asking all kinds of interesting survey questions. Like this week, he asked us, should we have, we offer, if you get a hunting license, you need to take a hunter safety course. He asked the question, should fisher people take a fisher safety course before getting their fishing licenses? And the responses are tremendous, all over the place. And so it's really worth talking about. We also talk about fishing gear. We talk about science. We share funny stories. We tell bad jokes. And this week I had a lot of fun. I posted the question up here, and I said to the group, tell us about your pet, but instead of pet, replace your pet, your type of animal is, with fishing buddy. And I started off by saying, my fishing buddy likes to poop on the ice. And then Matthew Filippi says, my fishing buddy loves to chase squirrels and eat cat turds. Greg said, my fishing buddy likes it when I rub her chest. That's a good buddy. Rodney Simon says, my fishing buddy is afraid of fish. Gerald, she said, my fishing buddy Munchkin wears a tuxedo all the time. His favorite fish is salmon. Will Harden, my fishing buddy licks my face. That's a odd buddy. David Anthony says, my fishing buddies don't do cold. John King, Crappie Hippie, my fishing buddy. I'm going to try and do my impression. This is John King, crappie-headed redneck from Eastern Australia. My fishing buddy swims around wearing golden sequins with poop trailing out of his ass. So Sandy Jelinas says, my fishing buddy begs me for treats every time I go near the kitchen. Jennifer Longworth, my fishing buddy squeals whenever she brings me something from the other room. John Sutter, my fishing buddy likes to open doors around the house at 3 a.m. and headbutt the window when he sees birds. Excuse me. Rich Collins, our fly fishing correspondent. My fishing buddy drags her ass along the carpet while paddling her legs to keep the momentum going strong. That's a good buddy. Dave Callum, my fishing buddy humps other fishing buddies. So does mine. Doc says one of my fishing buddies is afraid of water and will only poop in boxes. And my other fishing buddy loves the water and eats the poop from the boxes. Tony Long, my fishing buddy prefers moss to walk on, lives in a cave, and eats night crawlers. He must have I don't know what that is. My fishing buddy was found on this is Michael Frank, was found on a trail along the river, but the best of my knowledge, he has never been fishing. He'd probably be good at it, though, since he's very persistent and has great reflexes. I wonder what it is. Scott Nadaldi, my fishing buddy, takes long naps and eats treats. Olaf Nelson, my fishing buddy, jumps up and runs away every time she farts, even if it happens when she's asleep. So that happens to my buddy. Brian McGilvra, my fishing buddy, Dutch, is always chewing on a bone, and he always lets me know at awkward times when he's got to go. And Charlie McGee, from Bucks Bass and beyond, sometimes my fishing buddy eats the bait. Still, I love him, but the bait farts in the car on the way home are brutal. I'm sure of it. I have no doubt that's to be a true statement. We're having a contest going on right now. We're giving away an effing prize package featuring some lead-free lures from Glasswater Angling, a Fish Nerds beanie, some decals, and other fun. And the contest this month, you just get to call us in, tell us what your biggest fishing disaster is. Call 607-378-FISH and leave us a voicemail and tell us your biggest fishing disaster. And when you do it, this is really important because it's hard to edit these. Do this right. I'll send you a decal if you do this right. If you do this right. So you call us up, beep, boop, 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 and say, my fishing biggest, say your name. Like, I'll give you an example. My name is Clay Groves. Notice how slowly I said my name. Slow enough where if one were writing it down and trying to spell it, one could possibly do that. Do that. Write it so someone else can spell it. My name is Clay Groves. I'm from New Hampshire. My biggest fishing disaster is last week, my ice shack sank through the ice. And then give some details of your story. When your story's over, stop talking for like a second. And then very slowly and clearly, as if somebody has to write this down, give us your address so we can mail you a decal. Excuse me. And for God's sake, please don't assume I know your zip code. And I'll mail you a decal if you do that for me. I'll be your best friend. I'm a little grouchy about it because I have a decal going to someone named Alex in San Diego. I don't have his address. I got a guy named Daryl from some island in Oklahoma, Monkey Island. I don't have a last name. It's really hard to mail things to people if I don't have addresses and names. I can't breathe. 607-378-FISH. Please save my voice. John King, give us some news.
News, fish in the news. Everybody loves their fish in the news.
And so let's talk a little bit about what's going on in Somalia and how fishing, this is fishing in the ocean like commercial fishing, led to piracy and the social pressures and the political ongoings, these patterns that keep repeating themselves. This is what's going on in Somalia as people try to make a living off of the ocean. The thing is, the fishing off Somalia's coast, I guess, is particularly rich, and it's been a tradition for coastal Somalis for a long, long time. Now, the problem is that with climate change, more of the Somali nomadic peoples from the interior are moving to the coast and trying to get in on fishing or looking to change their sustenance from herding to fishing. And so there's becomes, some pressure there. And what happened, a few years ago is that the Somali fishers, fishing is a tough game, commercial fishing. And what they would do is run people off what they considered Somali waters. Unfortunately, these sorts of scuffles and this sort of intimidation and outright encounters escalated, until, certain groups of these fishermen started figuring out it was much easier to hassle boats full of oil and other items of merchandise and pirate them and take a ransom there rather than, trying to fight it out over a net full of fish. So that's actually how the whole piracy thing grew to become a luxurious, well, not luxurious, but a real dangerous and ongoing thing in the Somali waters. So what originally began in a fighting over fishing grounds escalated into this piracy. Now, of course, now that, millions of dollars in merchandise are at stake, other governments are taking notice and, trying to get this situation stopped. More and more Somalis are still trying to transit from herding and the nomadic lifestyle in the interior to a coastal living, and they're still running into lots and lots of problems. So now that national attention is on the area, things are a little different, and we've gone from armed conflict to a domination of another kind. Okay, so one of the problems with fishing in the area is the Somalis are terribly under-equipped compared to their rivals, especially ships from Iran and China. And not only that, Somalia is divided into Somalia and Somaliland, although not many countries, only like 15 countries recognize Somaliland. So now we have two governments, or a government and a quasi-government, and but both the governments are extremely weak and can't enforce any kind of maritime boundaries. And in the meantime, instead of fighting and having it out on the seas with the fishermen from Somalia, the Chinese especially have been going into the government channels and greasing the way with whatever amount of cash it takes to get quote-unquote permits to be within Somali waters and fish all they want there. So it's a real ugly situation, and there's only reason there's any attention on it, of course, is because of the piracy and because of the carrying on now. Like I say, once the merchandise was threatened, people took notice, and they want to end the piracy, and they want to look at the social factors that are causing it. It's really kind of sad, though, that these people can't just, get their livelihood from the sea and control their own destiny in that way. And to turn around and have your government undercut you by issuing 31 permits to fishers who are going to just take the harvest and take it clear the heck away, to the benefit of basically no one in Somalia, has got to be particularly hard to take. But that's how it goes when nations around the world practice what's called economic imperialism. I mean, you all know good old-fashioned imperialism means we bring in a bunch of soldiers and weapons and kill a bunch of people and then, tell them what they're going to dress like, think like, whatever, and take all their stuff and then maybe leave after they rebel or what have you. Well, it's a lot neater and cleaner nowadays. We just go in and drop money all over the place and basically buy out the people that are in power, and from there do whatever we want. And that's basically what's going on in Somalia. People are being paid off to give away the country's resources in terms of fish, and these poor people are out on the coast doing their best to make a living, and I really feel for them. I think before we go writing off countries as third world assholes and saying, hey, it's all their fault, you might want to give a care and think about, your day in the boat and how that might be different if you were hauling nets all day and facing the fact that some giant ship's going to run you off the grounds and put you on the edge and keep you from getting your justified amount of the resource. But anyhow, I found this in all different sorts of sources, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, other places. It's an ongoing story. I'm sorry I did not list the sources out properly, but it's really more of a political history and progress type of thing. And it's interesting to me simply because it's about fish and fishing and competing for the resources that we all should be sharing. Anyway, on the plight of Somalia today and the roots of the piracy around Somalia in fishing, this has been Crappie Hippie, your tree-hugging redneck from eastern Kansas, saying tight lines and Valentines. Peace out.
News, fish in the news. Everybody loves their fish in the news.
In just a minute, we're going to be coming back from a little break. We're going to take a little break, a little PSA here from Bluefish Radio, and then we're going to come back with Doc Martin and Doc Gido to hear about the work that they're doing, but I thought it might help if I can do it.
I'm Lawrence Gunther, and this is another Bluefish Canada stewardship tip. I'm a big fan of live bait when I fish for walleyes. And sometimes I wonder, what am I doing this for? When you're spending 50 cents a minnow, that starts to add up. But it's not just an economic issue. It's an invasive issue. When we start to bring minnows and other creatures, we may be introducing disease. We may be introducing invasive species. We have to be super careful that the kinds of animals and critters and creatures we're carrying around with us aren't impacting the places we're visiting. You make sure that you're not dumping your live minnows into the lake when you're done. Save them for the next time. Keep a little aerator at home. Do what you have to do, but don't introduce foreign life forms into places you visit. For all the latest Canadian fish and fishing news, follow Bluefish Radio.
I thought it might be helpful if I read the abstract so you know what they're talking about, because they tend to jump in these articles, so we don't know what they're going for here. So, the article is called "Pockets of Resistance: Response of arid-land fish communities to climate, hydrology, and wildlife." Published in Wiley Freshwater Biology. The abstract: disturbing. I can't breathe. I take it back. I'm going to post the abstract at fishnerds.com. You can read the damn thing yourself. Then you can listen to Doc Martin. If I had more patience, I would do it. You can hear, I can't breathe. I just want to make you a podcast. Is that so wrong? Screw it. Here's Doc Martin.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Fish Nerds podcast, where me, Doc Martin, gets to interview another nerd about their research. So here I have a super special guest today because this is the guy that was my PhD advisor and let me have a career in sciences in the first place. So without further ado, I will let him introduce himself. So, you want to...
Hi, I'm Keith Gido. I'm a professor of biology at Kansas State University, and I am a fish ecologist / nerd.
That's right. The best nerd, the best kind of nerd, right? The fish nerds. So Keith, or Dr. Gido, I guess, if you would prefer.
You can call me Keith.
All right. So how did you get to where you are today? Like, what was your career trajectory?
Yeah, well, it changed over time. When, from a high school kid, I've always enjoyed fishing in the outdoors and keeping fish in an aquarium. And then that led to an undergraduate education in fisheries and wildlife biology. Once I started working for the state agency, doing management, fisheries management, I really enjoyed the science side of that. So I got a master's degree in biology, actually, at the University of New Mexico. And then I got really interested in ecology in general. But I always loved fish, so I just applied that to fishes, and that encouraged me to pursue a PhD at the University of Oklahoma, investigating fish ecology, and did a postdoc, and I was lucky enough to land a job at Kansas State University, and it's been all downhill from there.
Oh, yay. We all just feel all rosy now.
Success to my wonderful graduate students, by the way.
Oh, yay. I'm one of the so many of them. Yep. Okay, so we're actually here. So you've done a lot of research, some with me and, of course, all your other graduate students. But we wanted to choose maybe one specific thing that actually does cover quite a bit of the research you've been doing over the years. So I happen to know this because I've helped out in New Mexico, right? And so I'm a little bit more familiar with your research than some of the other folks I've interviewed. And so this is a really nice comprehensive paper kind of overviewing a lot of the work you guys have been doing out there. So let's start with just where that is. So we're down in the Gila River, New Mexico. And do you want to tell us a little bit about the habitat and the flora and fauna out there?
Yeah, well, the Gila River, the headwaters of the Gila River, or some of the headwaters begin in New Mexico around Silver City. It's a great area because there's a lot of wilderness, big tracts of wilderness that is protected land through the U.S. Forest Service, the Alto Leopold Wilderness and the Gila Wilderness. And so it's a very pristine area that there's been relatively few dams, a few very small impoundments, but it's a natural flow regime. It flows from up in the high mountains, maybe Mogollon Peak is probably 10,000, between 10 and 11,000, down into the desert. It flows into the Gila River, flows down through Arizona and out into the Sea of Cortez there in Mexico, below Yuma, Arizona. But we mostly work in the headwaters in New Mexico. We don't really work in the cold headwaters where there's the Gila trout, which is an endangered species. But just below that, where there's several endangered species and a very threatened fauna, because of all the human modifications that have occurred in the rest of the Colorado River Basin. This is sort of the stronghold for native fish. And so it's been a really interesting area to work and an important area for conserving many of these species that don't exist or do well elsewhere in the basin.
Sure. And so what kind of fishes in general are we talking about?
Yeah, so the two federally endangered species that we work mostly with are the loach minnow and the spiked dace. And they're small fish. They don't get much larger than 2 or 3 inches. They have fairly short lives, but they're beautiful, as are all fish. But there's also some other native fish there there's some sucker species, a couple sucker species, the desert sucker, the Sonora sucker. There's some really cool chub there. There's the headwater chub. There's the Gila chub, the round-tailed chub. There's a lot of controversy on whether they're different species or not, but they're all really neat fish that are a little larger, really fun on the fly rod. But then there's also non-natives. So there's a lot of bass and catfish that are not native to the system that can have negative impacts on those native fish, and that's part of the challenge of working out there, or of trying to conserve the native species out there.
And so you brought up 2 great things that the fans have actually heard a couple times before. So we did interview Dr. Tobler a little while back. And so he talked about kind of evolution and the differences between species. And so when you bring up that, are the species really different species? We've had that conversation before. And so do you happen to know what the key argument is between those 2 being species or not?
Yeah. So a lot of it is just geographic separation. And so some, like in the upper Gila Basin in New Mexico, it's sort of an isolated area compared to the Verde River, which is also in the Gila River Basin, but it's in central Arizona. And so there's a lot of space between those. And so there's geographic separation across within these basins. But also, there's also differences where they occur in the basin. So if they're up in the headwaters versus they're down in the bigger rivers, and the argument for them being different species is they look different. So there's some physical differences in just their body shape and their coloration. Mm-hmm. But the geneticists get in there and they find they have rules and they find some differences. And that's why it's controversial, is because, how much different does it have to be? And, and in my opinion, it doesn't really, it doesn't matter. I mean, they're unique. All these populations are worth conserving, whether you call them a species or not. They're unique. They have unique genetics. They have unique characteristics. And so they're all important populations.
Well, I'm not going to argue with that. Of course, I'm a little biased as well.
Sure. Yeah.
Great. So now that we know a little bit about the geography and the species we're working with, let's kind of get into the details of the study that you've done. And I don't know, would you consider this like a meta-analysis because it kind of takes into account a lot of your previous work? Would that be a fair characterization?
Yeah, well, we combined two sort of databases to write this paper. One database, a colleague of mine, David Probst, who was with the New Mexico Game and Fish, began back in the 80s, and he started sampling the Gila River at particular sites, and we've been continuing to do that ever since the 80s, the late 80s. So at the time when we wrote the paper, we had 29 years of data, but we now have more. But actually, when I was an undergrad, I actually helped work on that project, so it was kind of cool to be there when he began sampling in the Gila River. But so that's the one database. So we just looked at over time, we looked at the long-term patterns of change and how the fish community changes and how it responded to extreme events. And so we highlight the importance of drought and wildfire in this paper. Mm-hmm. And so over almost 30-year record, we could see how the drought impacted the fish communities. So you can get these big droughts out there, and usually when things are dry out west, you get the lightning strike, you get wildfire, and that can have impacts. Then the other study was one that you and Erica were involved in and helped with. Mm-hmm. It was began in 2008 and was about a 10-year study, but it covered a lot more area, and so we were able to look at more different locations and how these impacts, because we had a really massive wildfire in 2011. Actually, there was a series of wildfires between 2011 and 2013. And so that allowed us to look a little closer at the impacts across more locations.
So you have just one with few locations, but really long term, and another one with lots of locations. So you get that broader spatial scale, but not as long term. So you kind of have that. That's a really nice complement to one another, actually. Yep, and I have one story that I don't think you know from my work with James and Tyler down on the Gila, and I want to share that, and then we'll get back to the paper. We were down, I don't remember which site we were at, but James had the backpack fisher on, and Tyler and I were netting, and we scared something up. We were in maybe knee-deep water, and it hit me in the ankle, and we thought it was a really big catfish of some kind, because you can get them down there, right? Just really big in those holes. So they're like, you got to get it. You're all screaming like, we got to get this fish because we haven't found anything else. And so we got to get like the one thing we've shocked up. Right. So I stick my net down and I catch it, and it's like a really big beaver. And I'm not kidding you. James and Tyler both go, ah, and run up on the shore. And I'm stuck there with this beaver in my dip net, not knowing what to do. So there you go.
That's awesome.
It was very exciting.
Like being shocked.
No, he was very upset. Yeah. But he swam away. He was fine. We were all fine. It was very exciting. Not a catfish. Yeah.
You netted a beaver.
I did. Very briefly, I would add. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, back to the study here. So you kind of looked at 3 different variables: the flooding, drought, and fire. Mostly kind of focused on, I don't know if you separated flood and drought per se. You kind of did. But it's mostly those the extremes of those, which would include floods and droughts. And then you looked at that with response to just the general habitat characteristics. So is it a main stem? Is it a tributary? Is there more places that these fish can kind of hide and get away and survive these extreme events? And then you also looked at the magnitude of those events. So how extreme were they? And then you also, interestingly, looked at how the traits of the fishes might help them respond to some of these extreme events. So let's talk about maybe how you characterized flooding, drought, and fire. I know that those things all happen all the time, but I saw some graphs here with 90th percentiles and things like that. So you kind of parse that apart a little bit. So how did you treat that data?
Yeah, well, so drought, there's a lot of statistics that like the U.S. Geological Survey keeps to quantify how dry things are. It's really important for agriculture and other reasons. And so we use a Palmer Drought Severity Index, and it basically measures water availability. So it considers how much it rains and how much that water is available probably for plant growth mostly. But anyway, it's a good index of wet and dry years, and they actually have a rating system. So positive values mean that it's a wetter than average year. Negative values means it's drier than average year. But these years these 2011 through 2013, actually 2013 was the driest year on record.
Except, I think that one was the one with the biggest monsoon season, right?
It also had the biggest monsoon, so it had one of the biggest flows later in the year. Mm-hmm. And so it was really, it makes it very difficult to tease apart what's really influencing these.
Well, and I mean, that's wild that 2013 was the driest. Oh, wait, except for this massive monsoon flood.
Yeah, big old flood. Yeah, it was a massive flood.
I imagine myself being a little fish in that river where it's like, man, I could really use some water. Not this much. It's too much.
Yeah. Like from a fire hydrant, right?
Right.
Exactly. So, but yeah, so that's, and then so that's how we quantified that. And that's just based on measuring rainfall and in the region and temperature and evaporation. The amount of flooding and the flows in the river are pretty easy. U.S. Geological Survey has gauging stations in a lot of streams and rivers, and they had one in the Gila River that we used. And then we also quantified wildfire. And they actually, when you have a fire on the landscape, the U.S. Forest Service does a pretty good job of through a geological information system, the GIS. They map the boundaries of those fires or the perimeter of those fires, and that those data are available. And so we were able to look at our locations where we sampled and look at the catchment above it and determine the percent of that catchment that burned in any given year. And that's important because if you have a lot of area burned, and then and the burnings usually happen in the summer, and the summer is very predictable, low or no precipitation in the Southwest, in the American Southwest. So when you can go out there in June and pretty much be guaranteed it's not going to rain. But the monsoon season hits later in July and August, and so if you have a wildfire in June, and that's usually when they occur, and then you have that rain event, it'll all that ash from the fire will get flushed into the stream, and that's where the problem occurs for the fish. Is it can suffocate them and cause poor water quality, and it result in a lot of mortality.
Sure. And so those are the three variables that you looked at in combination to that habitat, magnitude, and fish traits. So how can, I guess, the habitat and fish traits maybe make the response to those things better or worse?
Yeah, so the fish traits, what we were interested in knowing if large fish or small fish basically would respond differently to these disturbances.
And what is a large versus a small fish? Can you give us an idea of what that means?
Small fish might be something less than, do we use metric or 3 inches or maybe 100
well, whatever you feel, whatever feels right, Keith.
Whatever feels right. Okay, good. Like less than 3 inches or 100 millimeters or something like that is a small fish. And they're usually like these endangered fish I was talking about at the beginning of the show there. The large fish can be up to, they can get over 300 or 400 millimeters or maybe, I don't know, more than a foot long. And they actually can live a long time. They are really fecund, so they have a lot of eggs. And so you might expect these bigger fish to be better swimmers. They might be able to escape these events. They also might be able to just have better physiological tolerance. And so we were curious if the size of the fish would respond or change their response.
I have a quick question. Sorry. So, when you talk about the size of the fishes, but from what I recall, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but a lot of the larger fishes are also non-native. Is that true?
Well, it's true. There's the suckers are the native large fish.
Yeah.
The large non-native fish are the catfish and the smallmouth bass.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, you're right that a lot of the non-natives are the larger fish.
You did take that into account though, didn't you? Yeah, you did native versus non-native.
Yes, we did.
That's
So that was another thing that we were also interested as far as traits go is do the native fish that are adapted to that area. So they had an evolutionary history of floods and drought and wildfire. Would they respond more or faster than the non-native fish, which are introduced usually from the Mississippi River Basin, and they may not have that same evolutionary history of ability to respond.
Yep. All right, and then so how might the habitat characteristics kind of help that out?
Yeah, so then with habitat, it depends on it might depend on where you are. So if you're up in the headwaters, so if you're in a small little creek up in the mountains versus if you're downstream in the big river channel, the thought there is that the smaller creeks, if there's a wildfire in a small creek, it's likely to be really intense. But the wildfires are kind of patchy, so the wildfire might not hit all the small creeks, right? So we'd expect the effect to be really strong in those smaller creeks, the headwaters. But there's probably some. It's less likely that they'll be affected because unless it's a really huge wildfire. Whereas downstream, no matter where that wildfire is, that ash flow will eventually make its way downstream into the bigger habitats, right? But it will potentially be diluted because you have all these streams that join together to form those large streams or rivers. And so by the time the ash gets down there, it's diluted enough that it might not have the same impact.
Okay, so there's a couple different factors going on, and it's really just about where those fires really take place and how extensive they are, as to whether or not they could be more intense.
Yeah. Okay. That's good. Sorry.
That's okay.
I didn't put the sticker on my door to don't disturb me.
No worries. So basically that's the location of the fire, how extensive it is, and then exactly where it's located will dictate whether maybe it's harsher up in those tributaries or down in the main stem. We do unto those downstream as you would have those upstream do unto you, right?
That's right. That sounds good. That should have been our title.
That'd be great. All right. So, what did you find?
Okay. So, basically, the body size didn't matter.
Interesting.
And whether it was native or non-native didn't matter. But I need to preface this with the fact that those probably do matter, but what was really overriding of importance is where that fire was. So we had some sites that just got hammered by fire, and the fire burned really intensely. There was a lot of ash on the landscape. So when the monsoons came in, they just pushed so much ash into the river that it just killed everything indiscriminately. Right?
It just didn't matter. Yeah.
It didn't matter if you're native, non-native, you're large, you're small, you didn't do well. And that was sort of maybe that was sort of the surprising part of it, is that we thought that some of these species might have different abilities to contend with those disturbances, but it turned out that it was such a extreme disturbance that it didn't matter what your trait was. So I think those factors are body size, native and non-native, are probably important factors, but it was hard to determine here because the severity of those events.
When I noticed that a lot of your models, it turns out that there's a lot of variability in ecological systems. I don't think that's a surprise to any ecologists, but that tends to maybe be surprising to people that aren't in the field. Yep. And so it's really hard to know, hey, with all of this variability and all the literal possible factors that are happening in the world at this location, how important are these three, right? And parsing apart everything else that's going on. And then, so you do what you can. And so just because you didn't find something doesn't mean it isn't important.
Yeah.
Right? And conversely, if you do find something, what is that relative importance? And that's the really hard thing to balance when you're doing ecological research.
Yeah, I mean, if I would love to do this again and under a less extreme disturbance to really test those.
Do you think that's possible in this system?
Well, you'd have to be real lucky. I mean, we let me just be clear here. We got very lucky because we started this project. We started sampling these locations before this wildfire happened. So we were able to look at the effects of these wildfires because we had information before it happened and then after it happened. And the only reason we didn't start it beforehand saying, hey, we know in 3 years there's going to be these massive fires, right?
Right.
It was part of another project. And we just got sort of stumbled upon the fact that in the middle of the project, all the fish disappeared. And all of a sudden it became a wildfire project instead of a food web project. And so, anyway, it was, it was somewhat lucky there. So, yeah, is it possible? Yeah, but, it's hard to predict when these events are going to occur and the severity of them. So.
Yeah, I do think one interesting thing that you did find, though, is you did look at the time to recover of these ecosystems, right?
Yeah.
And I know you looked at just the size, that tributary versus main stem. Did you also look at native versus non-native recovery?
We did.
You did, okay.
There was, so interesting. So the native fish recovered quite well. It was really interesting. They came back, and at most sites, some sites we're still waiting, but for the most part, all the native fish came back. Some of the non-natives came back, but some didn't. Were slow to recover. So, I think there is something there, but it was hard, statistically, to show that there was that difference between natives and non-natives. Mm-hmm. But there certainly was a difference between the tributaries of the main stem. And so, as predicted, some of those smaller tributary sites, they were the disturbance event was much more extreme, and they took a long time to recover. Whereas the main stem sites, which are they were maybe the disturbance was less intense, but they're also open. They have open access to lots of other areas. They recovered quite rapidly. So,
and does that go along with what you predicted? What you thought you would see in the system?
It was, yeah. So that's what we predicted, and it has to do with sort of that connectivity, so that those downstream sites, anything that survived upstream, is real easy for them to recolonize. Just go down. You just float downstream and take up home. Downstream recolonize. The problem with those smaller creeks is if you get wiped out on those small creeks, it's much harder for a fish to find the way back up into those areas.
Yeah, it's easy to go with the flow.
Exactly, going with the flow.
Yeah. All right. Well, is there anything else that you wanted to talk about this paper? Any of the interesting conclusions, or are you going to continue on with this? So where is your research going on New Mexico now?
Well, this was we kind of wrapped this up. I think we're going to continue the long-term work at the fewer sites. We've stopped sampling intensively the large number of sites, but I do think that maybe just as a parting note that climate change is happening. It's real, and these, if you look at the long-term record of wildfire and drought, the droughts are getting more extreme and wildfires are getting bigger. And so, look at Australia right now. It is up in flames, and I think that this type of work is really important because we're seeing more intense wildfires and more intense drought.
And that is a really big key into the changing climate, is that it's not just that events are happening, right? That there's rain or there's fire or whatever. It's that they're becoming more extreme when they do happen.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And that's something that's hard to think about, because it's like, well, there's always fires there, right? And that's true. That would be true. There is fires there. That's a natural part of that ecosystem. But that's something that where maybe the fires were more mild, and so the recovery was easier. So those fishes didn't get displaced as intensely, and so they could recover faster. But these are, the fires are still happening, but now that they're so extreme, they are indiscriminate, just like you said, and they're just wiping out everything. And so that recovery just takes a longer period of time. And so, and this is just one, it's a big area, but small in the scale of the global climate, right? Yep. But fires are here, and there's other things, other places like floods and, other kinds of ecological weather patterns, I guess.
And the other important point there is that you need to have areas that aren't affected, or you need to have populations that aren't affected, because you have these indiscriminate, massive events, and the only way that the fish are able to recover is that you have a refugia.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is why we need to conserve large tracts of land and stream area. Hatcheries play a role sometimes. Like for the trout, you have a wildfire, they'll take the trout out and hold them in a hatchery until the stream water quality improves, and put them back in. And it's not what we like to see. Conservation would be better to just let that work naturally, but there's it's important to have those refugia populations.
Right, especially with, the Gila would be the exception to the rule down in the desert Southwest, so that it is relatively natural still. Most places, most streams across the United States are not natural anymore. So the idea to let it just work itself out because nature always has isn't really a great point anymore, because it's not really a natural system, and most of them aren't. So ideally, yeah, it'd be great to say, well, we don't need to do anything. Nature will be fine. It's like, well, we've already kind of done the things. So now we have to work on how to fix it and make it back to what it used to be.
Exactly.
Yep. Okay. So what research are you going to get into now that this project is kind of wrapped up with a bow on it?
Well, actually we are, down in the Gila River. What we're doing now is we're, implanting these endangered fish, these small fish with, microchips, little pit tags. So
even the spike days?
Yep. Yeah. They have those,
Ooh, how small are those pit tags?
Well, they're small. They're 8 millimeters, 8 millimeters long, and they,
That's awesome.
the same one you use in your dog that they put in the neck of your dog.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, we're putting those in these smaller fish, and we're trying to figure out their movement. So how, and which has relevance to their ability to respond to disturbances, if they can move out or move back into places.
And so that's building on some work, because I remember putting in tags in some of the bigger suckers.
Yep.
Was that part of James's work?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. That's what I thought. And so those were a little bit bigger tags, if I recall.
Yep, that was easier. So yeah, but it's really cool. The technology's come a long way.
Mm-hmm.
We're putting pit tags in these small fish, and we're trying to get an idea of how much they're moving. And we're also working with there's a native fish hatchery in Arizona, and we're working with them to reintroduce fish that have been raised in the hatchery into areas where they used to be, and we're going to pit tag those fish, those hatchery raised fish, to see if they, when you plop them back in the stream, where they go. And so we're kicking that off this spring. It's going to be cool.
Very cool. Now, if I recall correctly, from the larger sucker study, there tended to be kind of these goers and stayers. So there's the fish that will go long distances, and then other fish that will just stay in that one place. Is that what you expect to find with these small fish?
It is. That is. We're the hypothesis for any fish is that you have that dual or dual behavior, where some are just jonesing to move. Mm-hmm. And some just are pretty content with where they are.
Would you say that that's maybe similar to that evolutionary plasticity of the shy-bold dichotomy? Yeah. It
is. A lot of people have kind of linked those together. And
do you think the goers would be the bold, and then the stayers would be shy? And so if you did the goers and the stayers, if you took those fish into maybe a more experimental manipulation, and you poke at them or whatever to get the shy bold response, you'd expect that to pretty much parallel?
I think you might see that. Yep.
Yeah.
I'm curious how much that changes over the life of a fish, because they may just decide to be shy one for a couple months, but then they might change their mind.
Maybe they had a traumatic experience, and they're like, I'm just going to hang out for a minute. But then, a few months later, they're like, I'm fine. Let's go.
Yep.
Yeah. And so how long will these pit tags stay in? And what's the rate of kind of recovery for these and monitoring them?
So the pit tags stay in for their life of the fish. We've got a method down that there's very little mortality, if any. But yeah, it's we probably, we put these antennas out. So you have a stationary antenna, you drop it in the stream. If you have a place that you're interested in, what they move. So a lot of these streams, they have they built barriers to keep the non-native fish out. And one of the questions is, do these fish go downstream of those barriers? The idea is that the fish will stay upstream of the barriers and the non-natives will stay out, and then they'll do really well. But part of the question is, do they move downstream of those barriers? Or do they move up into the tributaries from the main stem too? That's another question we're trying to tackle.
And so you'll have multiple of these kind of in-stream antennas set out to see that movement?
Yep. And if the fish swims by it, it'll record the unique number and the date and time and date when that happened.
How many river kilometers about are you covering with this?
It depends on where we are, but it could be anywhere from a really small little reach that's maybe 10 kilometers to over 100 kilometers.
All right. And so some of those little fish, based on Josh Perkins' work, we know that little fish can move really far sometimes, surprisingly far sometimes. Yeah. And so do you think the spike dace or maybe the loach minnow, do you envision one of those maybe being more mobile than the other?
That's a good question. The loach minnow lives in the riffles in the rocks. It kind of hangs out in between rocks in the spaces between rocks. That I might expect that fish to not move so much. I think if they find a little home in the rocks, they're probably happy. The spike dace is more. It is up in the water column in the pools and shallow runs, and they're always running around doing stuff. And they might be a little more mobile, would be my prediction, but I'm usually wrong. So we'll find out.
Cool. And are you gonna? Is this a seasonal thing, or year round, or multiple years, or what are you thinking about?
We're gonna begin with seasonal because it's a lot of effort to maintain those antennas. You got to change batteries out, and so we're just gonna try to focus on a season and see how things go, and we might expand that out if we can.
All right, sounds good. Any other parting words before we wrap this up?
No, thanks for having me on the show, and you're doing a great job with everything.
Well, thanks for letting me interview you, Keith. And if the nerds want to find out some more information about your lab, do you have a website or anything you can send them to?
Yeah. My website's pretty easy to find. Name's Keith Gido. Gido is the last name. I think if you Google me, there's not too many of us with similar names. So,
all right, cool. Well, and I can put that website up when our podcast goes, when this episode comes out. I'll make sure that Clay gets the information, and so you can click on the episode, and then you'll find the link to Keith's website where you can see all of his research if you're more interested in what he's doing. Other than that, Keith, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy morning. Is this your second day of the semester as well?
No, we don't start till Tuesday.
Oh, well, then I don't feel so bad.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Well, have a great start to your spring semester, and I'll see you at KNRC.
Sounds great.
Bye.
And we're back. We also had a straggler. We had a straggler calling in about our effing New Year's resolution contest. That contest is over. So you can still keep sending those in, but I'm not sending any more decals out for that contest. But here is our last one. But you can call in for the next contest, which is your fishy disasters contest. 607-378-FISH. And here it is. And then we're going to end the show because I can't do this anymore.
Hey, Clay. My name is Matt Philippi. I'm calling from the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. I was listening to the podcast where you had the fishy New Year's resolutions and was reminded that I forgot to call in. So my New Year's resolution this year is to get a council-wide fishing program up and running in my local Boy Scout Council, where I've been started working on that this past year, but this year is going to be the year where we really get it going so we can teach a whole bunch of young people how to fish and enjoy fishing in the outdoors and learn and get a lifelong love for the sport. Thanks for all you do, and in the podcast, I love listening to it every time I get it. Thanks again.
Hello, Fish Nerd Nation. This is Crappie Hippie, and I've got some ways you can help support the Fish Nerds. First of all, the most direct way to do it is go to patreon.com, look up Fish Nerds, and throw us a few bucks every month. $1, a couple dollars, whatever you can afford. It goes a long way, and it's a big help to us to pay for the little things here and there that add up when making a podcast. It's not cheap to make one, and every penny counts. But if you're like a lot of us, you're saying, hey, I've given all I can give. If it cost a nickel to shiitake, I'd have to throw up. You know, I'm overextended. I'm sorry. I just don't have enough left over for the nerds. That's okay, because we'll take your time instead of your dime. First of all, we appreciate the heck out of you listening to the show. So why don't you push on a little further and tell your friends about it? You love listening to it. Take the time to tell a friend or two, because word of mouth is the most effective form of advertising a podcast can have. Also, you know what to do, especially those younger folks that don't suffer from AGE like me. But heck, my mom can even do this stuff. Get on your Facebook, get on your Instagram, get on that the bird thing, the Twitter, and shout us out wherever you go. You hear a really good show and you want everybody to know about it, then let them know about it. Take pride in the Fish Nerds, because we're proud of you. And also, if you're sitting there playing around with us on the Fish Nerd group page, invite friends. That little invite bar shows up on the side over there. You know, there's a friend or two in there that would love to get in on the group. Invite them in. We'd love to have them. Okay, those are some very simple, very straightforward ways you can help support the show. This has been Crappie Hippie. Thanks, one and all.
So that's it. You've listened to a whole bunch of fish stories when you should have been fishing. Big fat thanks to Doc Martin. Big thanks to Bluefish Radio. Big thanks to John King, the Crappie Hippie. Can't thank Diana's Bath Salts and Wally Pleasant enough for our original music on this week's show. So until next time, follow the code of the Fish Nerd. Spawn early, spawn often. Never trust a free lunch with strings attached, and swim against the current every chance you get. I'm going to bed.
Whether you're fly fishing in a stream, getting those ankles wet, or deep in the ocean casting nets, Fish Nerds. Fish Nerds. Fish Nerds. It's a podcast.
Just for the halibut.
Fried in a basket or broiled in a pan. Eat it raw like you're in Siam. Fish Nerds. Fish Nerds. Fish Nerds. It's a podcast.